Hello and welcome to the 58th edition of the GreenWave podcast by Synergy International. I'm SYNI, your host, and today's topic are the iconic ski mountains at Alta and Jackson Hole, re-examined 1 year later, and what really happens to environmental ambition when the political weather turns warm, then suddenly freezes over. A year ago, we treated these two mountains as a kind of split screen for American resort decarbonisation, with Alta leaning hard into measured footprint work, and Jackson Hole leaning into big-ticket clean power signalling, both wrapped in a very simple truth. Ski resorts are in the snow business, and climate change keeps sending a larger invoice. Since then, the United States has continued its odd habit of turning proven science into a culture war prop, and plenty of organisations have learned to speak sustainability in a lower voice, with fewer buzzwords and more legal review. So, this episode is a field check. What changed at Alta? What changed at Jackson Hole? What stayed steady? What got sharper? If you want to know whether the last year produced real progress, you only need to track three things: land, power, and transport. Back in episode 4, when this pod was in its infancy, we described Alta as a resort that treated carbon accounting as a discipline rather than a slogan. The story we told then centred on matching electricity use with renewable energy credits through Rocky Mountain Power and its Blue Sky programme, alongside the less glamorous work of efficiency upgrades and visitor nudges toward carpooling and shuttles. That framing still holds. The newer material from Alta shows a resort that stayed in the same lane, then widened it. Start with land, because land is where ski area sustainability stops being abstract. In Alta's latest reporting, the Environmental Centre frames stewardship around restoration scale and repeatability, not one-off hero projects. The numbers are blunt: 13,000 native plants across 14 acres in a single summer, plus seed collection from 23 native species to feed the next cycle. Wetland mitigation also moved from a long-running project into a closed-loop outcome, with restored wetland area used to offset older impacts from infrastructure work in the Albion Basin. This is the kind of work that keeps a special use permit relationship credible. Alta operates under permit on national forest land, so you see a constant thread of collaboration with the US Forest Service, and that governance structure tends to reward documentation, monitoring, and follow-through. If you want the human signal behind those numbers, look at community participation. Alta's summary describes 20 stewardship and education events, drawing nearly 2,000 participants. That suggests the resort did not retreat into quiet compliance mode. It is still inviting scrutiny, still building a culture of hands-on conservation, still treating visitors as potential stewards rather than pure throughput. This is also where the political climate question becomes interesting. When the national mood gets hostile to environmental language, many organisations shift from outreach to silence. Alta did not. It kept inviting people to the table, then handed them a shovel. On the educational side, Alta really goes out of its way to engage its skiers about the history and microclimate of Little Cottonwood Canyon. One of the most engaging contact points with its skiers are the tours conducted by the charming and committed volunteers from the Cottonwood Canyons Foundation at the top of the Sunnyside lift. The format is deliberately low friction. Show up for a chat, and you are soon skiing through a moving seminar on canyon ecology, avalanche-shaped terrain, and why this place generates its own weather patterns that feel suspiciously personal when you are caught in a squall with fogged goggles. These Ski with a Ranger tours run in season, typically at 1 p.m. with no registration, staying on easier terrain for a short, guided loop that turns casual curiosity into informed appreciation, and it fits Alta's wider approach of pairing operational sustainability with public literacy. The Cottonwood Canyons Foundation itself is an unusually practical bridge between recreation and stewardship, built around two verbs, education and stewardship, then backed up with volunteer labour that shows up in the real world. Its work spans trail building and maintenance, restoration and invasive weed mitigation across the Cottonwood Canyons and the Wasatch Front, plus a steady drumbeat of public programming from ski tours to snowshoe outings and field trips. The message lands hardest in the watershed context. Big and Little Cottonwood Canyons sit inside a protected drinking water watershed for the Salt Lake Valley, with rules that exist because gravity delivers whatever we drop on the ground straight into someone's tap, which gives their stewardship guidance a sober edge that no glossy brochure can match. Now power, because power is where claims get slippery fast. Alta's sustainability reporting stays specific. The resort matched 100% of its electricity use with renewable energy credits through Blue Sky Select, and it quantified the estimate as 3,567 metric tons of carbon dioxide reduction for the year. It also notes that electricity accounts for more than half of the resort's annual greenhouse gas emissions. That framing is useful because it shows Alta understands where its operational leverage sits. It also hints at a practical strategy. If electricity dominates your emissions profile, then greening electricity and reducing electricity intensity produce compounding benefits. Alta also adds a second power theme that matters more than it sounds: snowmaking efficiency. The resort describes replacing older snowmaking lances and tower guns with newer equipment that produces significantly more snow per unit of energy, and it explicitly references energy to snow ratios to measure it. Snowmaking always sits at the centre of climate credibility for resorts, because it is both adaptation and energy load. When a resort invests in equipment that pushes down kilowatt hours per cubic metre of snow, that is a signal of long horizon thinking. It is also a signal that the resort expects variability and plans to keep operating without pretending that the old energy profile will remain acceptable. Alta's public environmental page also puts more footprint metrics in plain view than many resorts dare to publish. It lists cumulative trees and plants planted since the early 1990s, notes solar panels on site, references food waste diversion by tonnage, and points to LEED certified building work and electric vehicle charging. That mix is a portfolio approach: land restoration, waste diversion, building standards, electrification readiness. The political climate can tug at language. It struggles to tug at a capital plan that is already funded and already installed. So, Alta's 1 year delta is a big thumbs up. Same core philosophy, more quantification, more restoration scale, more operational focus on efficiency, and continued public communication. Now, shift to Jackson Hole, where the story is different for two reasons. First, Jackson Hole has a long-standing brand relationship with wildness and conservation because its terrain sits in and around iconic ecosystems and public lands, with operations tied to habitat requirements under permit. Just close your eyes and think of those Teton mountain peaks close to the hearts of so many mountain lovers. Second, Jackson Hole went through an ownership transition in early 2024, and ownership changes create a natural test. Does environmental strategy persist when the boardroom changes? On the ownership side, the sale to local investors, Mike Corbat and Eric Macy, took place 2 years ago, with public assurances that operations would continue without major changes and that the resort would remain outside large, conglomerate portfolios. The fact pattern matters less as gossip and more as governance. Continuity suggests the sustainability commitments were part of the operating plan the buyers chose to inherit. On the environmental side, Jackson Hole's own materials remain clear on the headline claim. The resort runs buildings, lifts, and snowmaking on wind energy, and it states that in 2019 it transitioned to 100% green power for its electricity needs, sourcing wind power directly from Horse Butte Wind Farm in Idaho. That is one of the most concrete statements a resort can make because it anchors to a specific source and a specific year. It also aligns with an older announcement describing the move through the local utility green power program and turning it on for year-round operations. So, what changed in the last year? The most visible change is the way Jackson Hole frames the next layer of decarbonisation, which is always the hard layer: vehicles, maintenance fleets, and guest transport. Jackson Hole's environmental page describes expanding a fleet of vegetable oil maintenance trucks, exploring electric fleet vehicles and snowmobiles, increasing fuel-efficient snowcats, and incentivizing commuting for guests and employees. It also points to free start bus passes for employees and season pass holders, and it highlights stakeholder alignment with local partners. Those statements are not flashy, and that is precisely why they are interesting. A resort already on clean electricity has limited upside from talking about clean electricity again. The next emissions wedge sits in fuel and movement is where political narratives collide with local reality. Transport is also where American ski resorts face their most uncomfortable emissions. Truth: a large share of the climate footprint sits in visitor travel, not lift operations. Resorts that care about this either confront it directly through transit partnerships, demand management and parking policy, or they avoid the topic and publish a recycling photo. Jackson Hole has increasingly leaned into visitor flow management. Its public transport and parking guidance explicitly ties policy to reducing traffic and local emissions, and it describes shuttle services designed to reduce vehicle miles. Some of the bus drivers that shuttle skiers to and from the local hotels to the resort have achieved local hero status after years of service, and their insistence on punctuality and reliability in our weather conditions. Yes, this is a shout out to you, Gerald. Jackson Hole also frames water quality and wastewater management in a way that shows regulatory seriousness, describing monitoring and compliance with external certified parties. That is operational risk management in a sensitive landscape adjacent to Bridger Teton National Forest and watershed systems that do not care who won or lost the last election. So, did the shifting US political climate slow Jackson Hole down? Not a chance. On the evidence available in their own communications, no obvious retreat appears. The environmental page is still detailed and specific in places that matter. Their ownership change has not produced a public downgrade. The resort continues to brand itself as values-led and environment-aware, which is a choice in a moment when an increasing number of US organizations choose silence. What did change, and this is where reading between the lines becomes useful, is the emphasis on process. Jackson Hole talks about setting emissions reduction targets, monitoring progress, and stakeholder alignment. That language fits a world where public claims get litigated in the court of social media, and in some states, in the court of actual courts. A process orientation is safer than a grand pledge. It is also, when done properly, a stronger foundation for delivery. Now zoom out to the political context without turning this podcast into a fake news reenactment. Over the past year, environmental, social, and governance backlash in the United States has continued to shape corporate behavior, often pushing organizations to avoid the label while still doing much of the work, especially when the work reduces cost, lowers risk, or meets customer demand. You can call that hypocrisy. You can also call it survival strategy in a polarized environment. For ski resorts, the incentives are even simpler. Climate change is a product availability issue. If you sell the joy of snow, you will keep investing in the conditions that keep your customers satisfied and showing up. The US ski industry has also built shared frameworks that make climate action harder to abandon quietly. Participation in voluntary industry programs like the National Ski Areas Association, Climate Challenge provides continuity and benchmarking, Once you start inventorying emissions and setting targets, it becomes part of management muscle memory. It also becomes part of lender, insurer, and permit narrative. That structure can outlast political cycles because it plugs into operational governance. So, when you ask whether politics unknowingly impacted these resorts, here is the most plausible answer. Politics likely influenced language, timing, and how loudly resorts talk about sustainability. Politics likely did not change their underlying business logic that pushes them toward renewable power, efficiency, ecosystem restoration, and transit partnerships. The mountains most care about temperature, snowpack, water, and wildfire smoke. If you want a sharper way to evaluate progress, take the 3-part test teased at the start of the pod. First, land. Did the resort restore disturbed areas, protect habitats, mitigate wetlands, and document outcomes over multiple years? The answer is yes in both cases. Alta shows multi-year wetland mitigation, closing out with measured restoration. Jackson Hole shows habitat conservation commitments tied to permit realities. Land work is slow, expensive, and hard to fake. Second, power. Did the resort move beyond vague claims and anchor to specific procurement mechanisms and sources? Again, we find 2 yes answers. Alta publishes its Renewable Energy Certificate strategy and even names the certification standard. Jackson Hole names the wind farm and year of transition. Power claims that include source and structure tend to be durable. Third, transport. Did the resort address commuting, buses, parking, and fleet fuels? Yes and yes. Jackson Hole explicitly pushes start bus usage, and it describes fleet evolution. As for private buses, just go ask Gerald how many cars he keeps in hotel parking lots each year. The town also has amazing access to free level 3 fast chargers throughout the community. EV owners are totally spoiled in Jackson. Alta, operating in a canyon context, continues to emphasize community and operational footprint, and it sits within a broader, regional transport conversation that is never simple. That is the substance. Now for the dry wit, because ski culture deserves it. Plenty of companies discovered that the word ESG can start a fight at a dinner table. Ski resorts discovered something harsher. A bad winter starts a fight with your cash flow. Most political arguments end when the next news cycle arrives. A thin snow year, like so far in 2026, might end when your season pass holders do. Finally, what should you take away from this year-over-year eco-check? Alta looks like a resort that kept doing the work, then got more precise, more restoration-heavy, and more efficiency-focused, with the same renewable electricity matching strategy at the core. Jackson Hole looks like a resort that kept its clean electricity foundation, then leaned harder into the tougher emission sources, vehicles and movement, while also navigating an ownership change that, so far, signals continuity rather than disruption. If you are a sustainability professional listening to this, you already know the meta lesson. Strategy survives politics when it is embedded in governance, capital planning, and operations. These 2 resorts are not perfect, and they are not saints. They are businesses operating on public lands under permits, inside ecosystems that are too valuable to treat as backdrops. Over the last year, their public materials show continued commitment, continued specificity in key areas, and a focus on the unglamorous operational levers that matter. And that brings us to the uncomfortable, motivating truth that the ski industry understands better than most sectors. Climate adaptation and climate mitigation stack as complementary operational pillars. You make snow more efficiently. You power operations with renewables. You restore wetlands and slopes you disturbed. You nudge people onto buses. Then you do it again next year. Politics can make the conversation louder or quieter, yet the work stays. Well, that's a wrap on our 58th GreenWave podcast episode. We appreciate you sharing your valuable time off the slopes. Find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, iHeart, Podchaser, Boomplay, and Player FM. Please follow the pod, share with friends, and leave a 5-star review. If you have missed any of our LinkedIn posts or the GreenWave Gazette, catch us on LinkedIn, X, Facebook, Instagram, or visit synergy-international.net. We'll keep reflecting on the trends shaping sustainable finance and global policy. Until next time, keep riding the green wave of sustainability.